Welcome to the first in our series of Google Plus versus debates organised by Intelligence Squared.
Tonight the big question is whether or not we should be calling an end to the war on drugs.
The war on drugs has failed. It just doesn't work. 40 years after Richard Nixon launched this senseless campaign, drugs are more available than ever, they're more powerful than ever. And let's talk a little about the unintended consequences of the war on drugs. And for this, I want to quote an expert in the field who writes of a huge criminal black market that now thrives to get prohibited substances from producers to consumers. The author of that quote? Why, it's none other than my opponent this evening, Antonio Maria Costa. So even those who prosecute the war on drugs recognize the terrible damage that it inflicts. What about the unintended consequences for public health? Well, in a regulated market, governments can protect people from the deadliest ingredients of narcotics. But by refusing to regulate, governments allow our young people, for example, to snort cocaine which is cut with rat poison or with fiberglass. That is not protecting our young people, that is killing them. And talking about killing, let's think for a moment of the tens of thousands of innocent victims in Mexico, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, whose deaths are the consequence of the unintended consequences of the war on drugs. Why do so many Latin American leaders now insist to end the war on drugs? It's because it's their compatriots who are paying with their lives for a policy of prohibition which the West can't even enforce. So please join in me in demanding an end to this senseless war on drugs. Thank you.
Thanks, Misha. Now, please welcome the orator in favour of retaining drug control, Antonio Maria Costa.
The motion tonight is not about war or peace. It's about drug legalization. And this motion must be opposed for many reasons. The first reason is factual. For over a century now, countries have unanimously agreed that drugs are dangerous to health and must be controlled. Without doubt, over time, controls on drugs have protected our health. Listen to the numbers. Tobacco. Misha, this is a good example, or a bad example of a regulated market. Tobacco is consumed by 1/3 of humanity and kills 5 million people a year. Alcohol, regulated in Muslim countries, otherwise free, is consumed by 1/4 of humanity and kills 2.5 million people. Drugs, cocaine, amphetamines, etc., are universally controlled and are consumed by a fraction of humanity. Less than 5% admit to use it once a year, which is a very broad definition. Drugs kill 500,000 people a year, 1/10 than people killed by the regulated market Misha mentioned, tobacco. I said and repeat that legalization will cause a drug epidemic. And I give you the evidence, not based on the common sense notion that greater availability of anything, drugs or anything else, causes great use, and in this case, addiction. There is something much, much more sinister around here. Behind posh meetings like tonight are big investors in the expectation that drugs one day will be legal. And I have in mind bankers and venture capitalists and pharmaceutical companies. They are all developing drug brands and marketing plans ready to enter the drug market. Ladies and gentlemen, drug legalization is privatization of investors' gain and socialization of our health losses. The 1% strikes again. I conclude with a third point, very briefly, Chair. Governments need to protect both health and security. Therefore, rather than legalizing drugs, which is an easy way out, I invite leaders to show political courage. First, treat addiction as an illness, sending addicts to hospital rather than to jails. Second, fight corruption, the main lubricant to drug crime. Mexico is a good example, President Fox. How can a corrupt country fight crime? And of course, oppose money laundering.
And we start with this. End the war on drugs to break the power of the drug cartels and release their grip on politics. I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Geoffrey Robertson, QC, the advocate for the motion. It's time to end the war on drugs. The floor is yours, Geoffrey.
Thank you, Emily. In 1971, Richard Milhous Nixon declared a war on drugs with the words, and I quote, "It will achieve a drug-free world." Has it, Richard Branson?
No, it hasn't. It's filled our prisons. It's not cut down the usage. It's cost millions in taxpayers' dollars. It's fueled organised crime. And it's basically been an unmitigated failure. The problem's got worse and worse every decade.
Mm-hmm. In one of Mr. Costa's reports recently, he said that 250 million people take illicit drugs. Less than 10% have any problems with it. So that rather means about 225 million people take drugs for pleasure or to relieve pain. Are they the enemy?
No, they're not the enemy. I mean, I just want to make it clear, I'm part of something called the Global Drug Commission. In Portugal, 10 years ago, they decriminalised drugs, and not one person has gone to prison. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they help people who are on heroin. They give them methadone, they give them clean needles, and they managed to reduce the amount of heroin addicts by 50%. They have managed to stop people breaking and entering. An enormous percentage less people are now breaking and entering.
And what about young people, people under 18? That's gone down.
That's gone down, I believe, on all drugs. But
and
but
any
anyway,
sign
the
of
most
these...
important thing is there's no sign of a major increase in a problem in any sectors. And
no sign of big corporations making money out of it?
No. So this is all they've simply done is decriminalise. It basically means that if my brother or sister or my children have a drug problem, I do not want them to go to prison. I want them to be helped.
And we've got Russell Brand, have we not, hanging out?
Hello.
Hello, Russell. What do you make of this? Should we end the war on drugs?
I don't think having wars on anything is a solution. I think that even in the nomenclature of declaring war against a problem, you exacerbate and enhance the problem. I'm a recovering drug addict and know that drug addiction is an illness, it's a disease. So by criminalising that, you criminalise a huge percentage of the population, you malign them and stigmatise them, you generate more crime, you create a criminal culture. And speaking from the perspective of a sufferer, it's simply not helpful. You feel like that you're outside of the mainstream culture.
What was your drug of choice, Russell?
I don't know if it was a choice. That's the nature of the disease. But I used a lot of heroin, I used a lot of crack, I used a lot of marijuana, I used a lot of alcohol. And I think regardless of the state of legislation that is prescribed to the drug, I don't think that drugs that are not dangerous, I don't think people should be taking drugs. I think the contrary. I don't take drugs, I don't drink. But I think by treating it as a crime instead of treating it as an illness, we have the wrong perspective. I think we need to behave altruistically and compassionately towards people that are ill, and I think that then we can systematically affect our society more positively. I think the minute you say that someone is a criminal, you ostracize them.
Russell, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
We now have hanging out Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico. Can you hear me, Vicente?
Yes, very clear, and hello to everybody.
Thank you for joining us. You were the democratically elected president of Mexico in the year 2000. You said when you started, the war on drugs is the mother of all battles. How do you feel about it now?
Well, I feel that in the case of Mexico, it's most urgent that we stop the war, and we need to reach peace. So we have to stop the war that has caused close to 60,000 young kids killed, 15, 25-year-olds, among them many innocents, among them over hundreds of policemen and hundreds of military. This war has caused a strong and heavy economic burden on the development of the nation. The loss of tourism, the loss of foreign investment, the loss of our pace of growth.
I'm going to you, Johan. Is this just a metaphor, war on drugs, or are people being hurt?
It's not like the war on poverty, which is a politician's metaphor. This is an actual war fought with actual guns just as much as Vietnam or Iraq. And it's really important to explain the mechanism by which that happens. When you criminalise a really popular substance, it doesn't vanish. You transfer control from doctors and pharmacists to armed criminal gangs. Those armed criminal gangs have no way of establishing contracts. They don't have franchises.
Are they quaking in their boots, the cartels?
On the contrary, we know that they are absolutely on the side of maintaining the war on drugs. Jorge Ramon, the head of La Mafia Cruenza, was caught on wiretap saying, "This war is an absolute sham that keeps all of us in business." Everyone watching this should know that the cartel bosses watching tonight have definitely got a side in this debate, and it ain't ours. Any country that enforces the war on drugs has a significant rise in the homicide rate, which is really important to understand. After alcohol prohibition ended in the United States, the homicide rate fell by 20% and never rose again to the same.
I'm now going to invite Elliot Spitzer, the advocate against tonight's motion. It's time to end the war on drugs. Elliot, put your witnesses.
Thank you, Emily. Let me invite General McCaffrey up. General, you, just to set the stage and so everybody understands, not only were a general in the United States Army, which is not to continue the metaphor of war, but also were in charge of drug policy during President Clinton's presidency. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I've continued since then being heavily involved in prevention primarily, but also drug and alcohol treatment programs throughout the United States. So the underlined one data point we got to get in the table. In the United States, which frequently we mention in this debate, we have reduced drug consumption by a third in the last 3 decades. Cocaine use is down by some 43%. Meth use has been cut in half. If you're in high-tech industry, in the armed forces, et cetera, we have minimal drug use.
General,
so the bottom line is, what I support is prevention and education and effective drug treatment while remaining adamant that we will confront international crime and the production of drugs.
Look, General, you have given a stupendous summary of what the primary objectives are, and I just want to make it clear, when you listen to the powerful statements from Richard Branson and the others, we do not oppose any of what they were suggesting in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment. Do we in the United States send users to jail merely because they're users?
But as a general statement, if I walked out the front door of this beautiful resort hotel smoking a doobie, it would be almost impossible to get arrested, for God's sakes, never mind prosecuted and jailed. In fact, people behind bars are not arrested and jailed for possession of 2 joints.
So just so it is clear, and time is short, we have to apportion among many witnesses, and I've spent many years as a prosecutor and the governor of a state overseeing a huge prison system. We do not incarcerate just for use. It is the violence that attends that use that sends people to jail. We treat users. Is that correct?
Without question. Again, I go back to real-world law enforcement, prosecutors jailed. That isn't the problem. The problem with heroin and methamphetamines and Rohypnol isn't whether they're legal or illegal, it's that they're ferociously addictive. And you end up with medical, social, work-related problems. You end up chronically addicted. Then your life is abject misery.
Okay, General.
So we've got to get you in recovery, and we know how to do it.
We do not disagree with you, Richard, about prevention and dealing with users. We're going to come back to kids in particular. Ed Villamy, I want to ask you if, since the topic of the first chapter was the cartels, what, in your view, would be the single best way to go right at the bloodstream of those cartels?
the one thing which stands a chance of throttling all the misery that's been discussed on both sides of this argument. You stop the swill of blood money from the cartels.
And how do you do it?
Gratefully received by the real cartel, which is the international banking system.
And how do you do it?
Antonio Maria Costa has referred to the Wachovia case. It was a rare glimpse of how all this works. $110 million, small change. That was direct drug money. We want to see the rattle of the handcuffs in the boardroom and the bankers in the cells, not the poor.
All right, stop. You're right. We got to turn off the spigot of blood money, and we have lousy prosecutors who have no backbone who aren't doing it. But if we legalized these drugs, which is what they're saying, what would happen to consumption? And tell us what the lesson of Portugal really is.
Actually, the crime rate has increased. It's not true that breaking and entering has reduced. It's actually increased slightly. I'm not saying it's increased because of it, but it is not true that the relationship between crime and drugs is as simple as presented.
But I want to go to Sandeep Chawla, who is also from the UN. Sandeep, let me ask you this. If we were to increase the access to drugs, do you think that use would go up or go down?
I think use would definitely go up, as would public health costs. So while crime rates may come down, public health costs and use would definitely go up. You've had the evidence of alcohol and tobacco. You can have it again for many other substances like this where use would go up. So what we are looking to do here is we do not need to stop the war on drug cartels and traffickers, but we do need to stop the war on drug users, and we need to treat them.
And you just said if use goes up when you decriminalize, does that mean addiction among kids would go up as well?
It probably would, because all the evidence tells us that the largest amount of experimentation with substance use, with substance abuse, with psychoactive drugs is with people in their younger ages. There are several countries in the world, for instance, the United States at the moment, which have an upcoming epidemic with prescription pharmaceutical drugs. And these are already regulated and controlled, and yet there's an epidemic with them. So it's perfectly likely that you make availability easy, you regulate it lightly, and use will go up, just the way as it has done with alcohol and tobacco over the years. And now we are trying to stop the prescription drug epidemic. We are trying to develop grassroots movements against tobacco consumption. Do we really want to set the clock back and try and lighten the regulation we have on these drugs?
A response to you. First of all, Russell Brand, you heard from Sandeep Chawla there that drug use would go up as a result of an end to the war on drugs.
Yes, I suppose it's kind of obvious that if something is more freely available, more people would do it. If we all lived in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, perhaps we would eat more chocolate. There is already prohibition against drugs, and it candidly, palpably, obviously isn't working. And also, there's no problem with people taking drugs if they're not drug addicts. If people don't have a drug problem, let them take drugs. The problem is some people have defective personalities that, like me, like if they take drugs, it's problematic. And if we criminalise them, it's the wrong cultural model. We need to treat people as if, that's why the crime happened. That geezer there that said if he could wander out of his building smoking a doobie, though that was the most preposterous image of the many lunatic images that have been presented. Like, yeah, of course that's no problem for people who innocently walk around smoking a doobie. That's not creating a problem. But once people are addicted to marijuana or any drug, then we need to have an infrastructure that protects those people. And if we fundamentally categorise those people as criminals, that's the wrong way of addressing it. The inevitable social and criminal problems that come from drug use are as a result of its criminalisation.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Russell Brand, thanks very much. Let's take a question from the front row. Peter Hitchens, you had your hand up.
Before he goes, I'd like to ask the alleged comedian in the hat whether we've had a lot of him, and far too much for me, but he says he's not responsible for his own drug taking. Isn't the problem with the Western countries that we repeatedly say, oh, we're not responsible. When we take drugs, we do it because we're made to. Somebody made me do it. When in fact, it's a pleasure that we seek. People do it because they want to. They do it for a pleasure. And then, as a result of the demand, a demand which drives the supply, then ruin and murder and warfare and bloodshed and all the other evils descend on the countries which supply. It all comes from us. It comes from rich Western kids selfishly following their pleasures and creating a worldwide industry and a huge flow of money which is disastrous for the entire globe. And we don't ever address it.
Russell Brand, I'll let you have a quick right to reply. I think you were being called a selfish kid there.
He certainly is.
It's nice to receive your bigotry from another medium other than the hate rag, the Mail on Sunday, through which you normally peddle hatred, insular thought, lack of love between human beings. What I'm saying, mate,
have an argument for a moment, would you?
Whether or not I'm selfish or wearing a hat is redundant and irrelevant. These are the kind of personal attacks, the aggressive stance that you continually adopt to vilify people needlessly. They can't listen to people like you anymore. We're too evolved as a species.
That's an idiotic slur. And I notice you don't actually answer my argument. Are you responsible for your actions, or are you not? Do you take drugs because you have to or because you want to?
In spite of what Margaret Thatcher said, there is such a thing as society. We are responsible for one another. If we treat people compassionately and with love, then people will benefit. People, of course, are responsible for their actions. You're responsible for writing for a bigoted newspaper.
Finish your joke, Russell Brand.
Are you responsible for your own actions? I really don't mind being unpopular.
Okay, I'm going to move the debate on because there's a lot of people that we'd like to get questions from. But before we do, over to the orators to tell us what they have learnt from this act. First, back to you, Misha.
Well, I've learnt, first of all, that the opposition is not prepared to debate the subject under consideration. Let's end the war on drugs. But I have to challenge Eliot Spitzer and General McCaffrey. I challenge you to go to Harlem. I challenge you to go to Southside Chicago and stand in front of the African-American community there and say that America does not incarcerate people for non-violent drug offences. Because the number of people arrested in 2009 on non-violent drug offences was 1,600,000. This war targets the people who are least able to defend themselves in society, and it must stop.
Misha, thanks very much indeed. Antonio Maria Costa, to you.
Misha, since you challenged me directly, I'm going to steal 15 seconds from my colleague. As the former Attorney General, a prosecutor, the governor of that state, I not only accept your challenge, you are dead wrong, sir. If you looked at the data, instead of just experiential standing on a street corner, you would understand this issue. Those of us who have presided over changing the laws of that state know exactly why people go to jail. You just heard it from Ted. It's because of the violence that attends to those crimes. You sit down with the DAs across the state, the defense attorneys, your data is dead wrong. You can stand on any street corner you want. I've been in the trenches doing it. That's the data we want. General McCaffrey, I want to go back to you on a critical issue here, and I think Russell Brand made some very powerful points about the way we as a society should embrace those who have a drug problem. We should not deem them criminals. We should not ostracize them. We need to help them and treat them. But the question I've got for you is, can you, in fact, create a regime of treatment if you do not have the potential of coercive threats behind you, such as the potential prosecution of those who are, in fact, addicts?
Well, you know, actually, Russell Brand may have inadvertently made a very powerful point. He talked about a defective personality he thinks he has, which I won't argue with, but one of the challenges is that if you use methamphetamine, if you use heroin, the Cadillac of all drugs, you're going to like it. And a very high percentage of us will then become chronically addicted, and we're a disaster to our families, our employers, the communities we live in. Now, one of the things we've done here in the United States, which I would commend to further study, is we tried to tie together rational drug policy and the criminal justice system. We have the drug court system.
And, General, just not to put too fine a point on it, though, I want to come back to the importance of having that coercive pressure of a judicial system as part of the opportunity to impose treatment upon the individual who is either an addict or a potential addict. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, coercive means family intervention with your employer on a confrontation to get you into treatment. coercion means in the drug treatment facilities we use, yes, methadone's essential for heroin and synthetic opiate addiction, but you also have to have counseling where, we try and do reward and punishment to get people's lives stabilized. And the way out clearly is treatment, but you've got to continue to have high levels of social stigma. And part of that is drugs should be illegal.
General, very quickly, because again, I'm trying to reach a whole number of witnesses here in this brief segment. The issue of whether or not it has been effective, and again, I don't want to use the metaphor of the war. Do you look to certain measures, certain indicia of declining drug use that for you say, you know what, the entire totality of the policies we've got right now somehow are productive and are working?
The crime rate in the United States in the last 30 years has gone down dramatically. If we weren't all carrying guns, half of us, and 5% of us are nutcakes, our homicide rate would also follow. But as a general statement, our crime rate's down enormously. Teenage pregnancy down enormously. Drug use down enormously. We're actually on a pretty good track.
General, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Nigel Keenan now. Nigel, why do you understand this stuff? What are your credentials? Real quick. The clock runs.
I'm a doctor and an investment banker, so hopefully I understand the medicine and the numbers. And I'd just like to say something to Richard and the other people who have spoken about Portugal. Eurostat's Statistics in Focus bulletin says that crime in Portugal is up by 17% since 2001. And it also says that the murder rate is up by 40% since 2001.
Can I interrupt one? 2001 is what happened in 2001?
2001 is when drugs were decriminalized.
That's when their policy went into effect.
Use, yes.
Okay.
And the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drugs Addiction, which is actually headquartered in Lisbon and whose chairman is exactly the same person that Richard spoke to, says that drug use has gone up across all categories since 2001. And the number of problem drug users is exactly the same today as it was in 2001.
Is there a story?
No significant difference. All they've done is succeeded in getting 30,000 people hooked on methadone as well as heroin with absolutely no plan to get them off. Reckitt Benckiser makes $500 million profit a year from one particular drug, Suboxone, which is used as a heroin substitute in the United States. And it's got the highest margins that I've ever seen, including cancer drugs or anything else. Investors would definitely be interested in this area if Misha succeeds in getting drugs legalized. And if he doesn't want drugs legalized, I'd like to know exactly how he defines the end of the war on drugs.
Lord Blair, and I'm from the other side of the ocean. This Lord stuff kind of gives me the quivers. But you're a Lord, and you were also the Commissioner of Scotland Yard. You're supposed to know something about this stuff, right?
Governor, I was as a cop for 35 years. I was the head of Scotland Yard, and I've stood in more crack dens than I care to remember.
All right, cop I can relate to, Lord not so much. Okay, what's your take on all this? I mean,
well, my take on this is Winston Churchill. Remember Winston Churchill, he was not the man who won the Second World War, he was the man who didn't lose it. And the argument for the legalizers is really this. What they are proposing is a probably irreversible experiment with at least the possibility of total catastrophe. We have no idea what a totally legalized drug world would look like. The only two places that are being put forward at the moment are Portugal and Western Australia. They are small, isolated countries. If the United States, the United Kingdom, France, India utterly legalized drugs, then we have no idea what that would look like. We have no idea what effect that would have on children and young people. But we've got some clues from the past. We know what 19th century opium dens were like, and they were appalling. And if I can just take you to one class of people, and we've heard a representative of them today, which is the people who are effectively beyond the law in relation to this, which is celebrities and pop stars. And just look at those histories. From Jimi Hendrix to Amy Winehouse, from Keith Moon through Heath Ledger to Michael Jackson, people cannot withstand this level of ability to take drugs. 90% of people don't take drugs because it is illegal.
Lord Blair, I'm being polite to you to try to interrupt you. Simple question, short answer. If sanctions were lifted, would use increase?
Massively.
All right, thank you, sir. I want to go now to Neil McGinnity. Neil, I want to come back to Portugal. You've studied this great length. What is your takeaway on Portugal?
Well, there's been, I think, some misleading statistics presented tonight which give the impression that Portugal is a rose garden. That is not the case. We are seeing now a steady increase in some of the indices of harm. But I think I'd like to also say that, you know, there is no country in the world, that is no country, not even a single country, that does not have a drug policy comprising three things. That is treatment, prevention, and enforcement. And it's easy to say, I prefer treatment in all of that because it looks nice, it's cozy, and I would like my loved ones to get that treatment. Now, we need effective treatment, we need effective prevention, but we need effective enforcement as well. If you have effective enforcement, that often is a catalyst, a powerful catalyst to get people into treatment. So it's completely misplaced to play off treatment as against enforcement. It would be absolutely crazy in the face of this global problem to take away one of the strands of our prevention, enforcement and treatment.
Neil, we literally have 15 seconds left. I'm not going to get to Ted. I apologize. We'll keep you there for the next round. But Neil, let me ask you this. If there were some regime of legalization, regulation, call it whatever the good folks on the other side want to call it, and you created a profit motive, so you had Glaxo, Pfizer, Philip Morris promoting use of drugs, would use go up or down?
Well, of course it would go up. There's absolutely no question about that. These are companies that are absolutely perfect marketing devices. And you put drugs into that mix, and you will unquestionably see the most smart, the most well-financed advertising campaigns, and you will see a steady increase in the level of drug use, way beyond the 1%.
The same way that tobacco companies have killed millions of kids for money. Is that what we're talking about?
You will see cocaine and heroin looking like tobacco and alcohol, and the consequences of that are beyond imagination.
Thank you,
given the level of addiction of these substances.
Over to you, Jeffrey. It's your turn.
Let me move to Bernard Kouchner. You're a doctor. You were the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières. You've been the health minister of France, the foreign minister of France. How does it stack up for you?
We have lost the war on drug. It was not effective. The drug consumers are more numerous, and the consumption is higher. So we have lost. But if we were talking about public health, because it was an argument on both sides, public health, I believe that it is not the right place, a prison, a jail, to treat, to take care of the people. It's better to prevent. How do you prevent drug consumption? This is a sociological, a political, and a psycho-sociological problem, okay? So this is very difficult. Poverty, we were talking about. It's completely true. And lack of ideals.
Steve Rolls, I'll bring you in. What do you make of this idea that if you end the war on drugs, you have suddenly all the big drug companies coming in?
Well, I mean, what would happen? We're talking about moving from a criminal sphere into a sphere of government, potentially government regulation, which can be as strict or as relaxed as we would want it to be. It's effectively a blank slate. So, you know, the idea that big pharmaceutical companies would take over these things and aggressively market them is, you know, I think that's wishful thinking. We can be as strict and as tight in our regulations as we want to be.
Have they done that in Portugal? Have they done it in Amsterdam?
No, they've only decriminalised use in Portugal. They're not talking about actually regulated markets. But if we do go in that direction, and I think certainly we should, you get to a place where you can regulate all the different aspects of the market. You can regulate the products, you can regulate the vendors, they can be licensed and vetted and so on.
So you can have, for example, small amounts of cannabis available only in licensed premises to persons over 18.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the opposition have talked about free availability. We're not talking about free availability, we're talking about controlled availability, and that level of control can be as strict as we want it to be.
And there'd still be severe penalties for anyone who sold a drug to a child or whatever.
If you have a regulatory framework, anyone who steps outside it is still subject to sanctions. And, you know, yes, Big Pharma may not be ideal, but Big Pharma is certainly better than Big Gangster, and that's what we have now.
Now, we've got David Eagleman on hanging out. Hi, David. You're
Hello, Jeffrey.
One of our top neuroscientists. Tell me what neuroscience is discovering about addiction.
Well, what's clear is the reason that we're losing the war on drugs is because we're attacking supply, and that's like a water balloon. If you press it down in one place, it comes up somewhere else. What we need to be addressing is demand, and that is the brain of the addict. And at this point, we know a great deal about the circuitry and pharmacology of the addict's brain. And we're developing in
what
neuroscience
what does neuroscience have in store for curing addiction?
There are at least 3 different ways that are being worked on. There are familiar pharmaceutical treatments that obstruct the effect of the drug, thereby blocking the high.
Okay, you block the high, then the next one.
There are newer treatments. There's one called a cocaine vaccine, which actually recruits the immune system to sop up the drug before it crosses into the brain.
So you take an injection and it stops your craving for cocaine.
That's correct.
Broadly.
And then
Tell us about the third one.
There are new methods we are working on that use real-time feedback with brain imaging. Essentially, it's like biofeedback, where we train up the frontal parts of the brain to exhibit more control over craving. So in other words, we train a person how to deal with the craving, and this is useful for people who have tried to quit, know they would like to quit, but have been unsuccessful.
So the addict, to put it bluntly or broadly, the addict can look at their own brain and watch themselves actually conquer the craving voluntarily. That's what neuroscience has in store.
That's correct.
And we know, finally, that there were $40 billion spent on the war on drugs in America last year. If that $40 billion was spent on neuroscience and its way of curing addiction, would we get that cure pretty quickly?
We could do a great deal in neuroscience with that money.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Geoffrey and the witnesses. And this is once again where we open up the debate, allow a little bit more freewheeling thought, and take some of your questions, both from inside the room. We'll be sending round mics.
Yeah, I'm just finding the argument from the against side quite disingenuous when it comes to children. Sorry, Governor Spitzer said that legalizing would increase the number of child addicts, but there's no mention of the numbers of children in Mexico and Colombia that are killed in drive-by shootings and abductions and things of that nature. So when we're talking about the body count and the consequences of these things, it's not as simple as saying, if we legalize it, then we'll have more addicts, and that's a bad thing, because the consequences of the criminalization are just terrible.
Your point is, of course, extremely well taken. The horror of what is happening and the violence in certain communities attendant to the cartel power is heinous. It's one of the most horrifying stories one can read. However, that does not address the absolute stark methodological certainty of what we are saying, which is that if you permit greater access to cocaine, meth, heroin, there will be more kids who become addicts, and that will then set off a trend line, because we all know that those who become addicts before the age of 18 are the ones who are almost impossible to cure. So there are separable problems. We're, of course, recognizing the one you talk about, but you must recognize the one we're talking about.
Can I just add also that we have in this country an estimated 300,000 children with addicted parents. Now, these children's lives are lost as dramatically and as tragically as those children that you just instanced. But they're not lost because heroin is illegal. They're lost because their parents care more about the drugs they're using than the children they should be looking after.
Neil, thanks very much.
And if you see that will increase.
We're going to begin Act 3 now, and this time we're posing the following statement. The case for continuing the war on drugs is built on political cowardice, not on public good. And Geoffrey, it's your turn to start the questioning.
I mean, who said, I beg the Labour government not to return to the war on drugs? David Cameron, when in opposition. Who said, the war on drugs is an utter failure? Barack Obama, before he became president and dedicated $40 billion a year to fighting it. So, Louise Arbour, why do the drug warriors always win? Why do these politicians never change?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of a culture of fear that has been built around, and we've heard it today time and again, this kind of over-characterization of this kind of flooding the markets with cocaine and all these terrible things if we move towards what is called legalization. This kind of rhetoric has tremendous kind of populist appeal. And so I think it's all based, like the war on terror, these concepts are based on a culture of fear, which is very easily cultivated. It seems to me the point we should make is the war on drug has had 40, 50 years of a run trying to make its point. And I think, just to put it very mildly, hasn't exactly been a great success. I think I would not overstate my case.
So ending the war would mean that other countries could experiment in their own way with decriminalization, with regulation.
Exactly. That's exactly what this Global Commission on Drug Policy that Richard is on, that I'm also serving on, is calling for. The mere fact that we're now talking about these issues is progress after 40 years of a kind of taboo conversation.
Let's have more Portugals, let's have more Netherlands and see what the evidence is. Do they ever look at the evidence? And Switzerland. We have
and Germany. I mean,
and South Australia and Western Australia.
Right.
There is a real refusal to look at the evidence, and it's really important we get these figures clear. The British Journal of Criminology, which has no dog in this fight, it's just there to find out independently what the facts are, says unequivocally, use went slightly up from 3.4% of the population to 3.7% of the population, but addiction was significantly down from 7.6 per thousand to 6.8 per thousand. HIV was down by 17%. We all agree on treatment. We have a way to pay for treatment. What the Portuguese did is they transferred all the money that is currently spent on arresting, harassing, jailing, trying addicts. They used all of that for treatment. That's our way of paying for it. In the middle of a global depression, how are you going to pay for a massive rollout of treatment?
Well, what we need, obviously, and what politicians need is more information. Ask for information, go to WikiLeaks. Are you there, Julian Assange?
I am, Geoffrey.
How are you hanging out?
Well, I'm here in some secret hotel room.
Right.
Not far from where I'm under house arrest.
And as far as you're concerned, how does it come down for you? Is there a question of individual rights here, of the right to change your own mind, to decide what you put in your own body, the right to decide how you'll think and imagine?
Well, I think we must start at basic principles. And basic principles say that we as individuals have a right to our own self-determination. We have the right to freedom of thought. We have the right to freedom of speech. And provided that we do not engage in some sort of violence to others, then our rights to do what we will with our own thoughts and our own body are sacrosanct. And the state should not be interfering with those rights. That in order to keep our freedom of thought, we should have the right to control our own mental states. And that gives some people extra creativity, and that is something that we need all across the world.
And so the 166 million people who take cannabis, according to Mr. Costa's report, they have a certain basic liberty to decide how they're going to think and imagine and what drugs they're going to use for relaxation, for pleasure, perhaps to reduce pain.
Well, Geoffrey, we should look at marijuana as a good example. I mean, this is a drug that is about as addictive as potatoes, and yet it is being swept up into this so-called war on drugs. We have to remember we really do have a war on drugs, and like all wars, it is a racket. It is a racket which has bought up huge industries that fight and lobby to keep the money flowing.
Vicente Fox, are you still out there?
Yes, sir.
What have you thought of the debate so far? You began it some hour ago.
Yes, I would like to comment on the case of Mexico, because Mexico is not a drug producer nation. Number two, we're not a consumer nation. Our figures are extremely low. Mm-hmm. What happens is that we're in between those who produce the drug on the south, the Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and those who consume the drug on the north. And this being in between is costing us a severe, severe problem to the nation.
Thank you very much, Nato Elliott.
Thank you very much. Steve, I know we have not been doing cross-examination as such tonight, but I just want to actually have a little interchange with you about one thing. Because you've been talking about a regulatory framework which would create thresholds in terms of the potency of any particular drug. Isn't it logically the case, and don't we know, as a matter of fact, the moment government does that, you will create a black market with drugs more powerful, more potent, and that very second you then have the black market we've been trying to eliminate, so you don't solve the problem?
Yeah, but you solve most of it.
No, you don't solve most of it, because the moment the drug addict can go around the corner and get something more powerful, he does it. And then you have the crime, and you have not solved the problem.
Well, yeah,
you just said yes, isn't that correct?
Most of the market is not seeking the most powerful drugs. I mean,
sure it is.
When you go into a bar, people aren't all
How
drinking
long have you
vodka.
when were you in a college? When were you in a college campus, Len?
People aren't all going into bars and drinking vodka.
Sorry, we're not the QC here. I'm sorry.
I mean, one of the things that we have within a legal market is that it tends to push the market towards the most potent concentrated versions. I can buy crack on the streets of London, but I can't buy coca leaf. Now, if you made an array of drugs of different potencies and strengths available, you might find actually that people migrated in the opposite direction. And in fact, if you then superimpose on that a regulatory system where the more dangerous drugs were more heavily restricted and the less dangerous drugs were less heavily restricted, you could shepherd people in the right direction.
Okay.
We can't do that with criminalisation because it's completely out of our
Okay, a
control.
lot of words said very quickly, and I'm sure most of them are right. But and we got your colleague here who wanted to be up here, but we couldn't fit him in. Yes or no? Will there not be another black market the moment you have those thresholds?
There will be a black market
Okay,
after
thank you, sir.
legalisation, but it will
Thank
be
you,
smaller.
sir. All right.
Smaller than it is now, and that's
Okay. General McCaffrey, you know I want to come back to you, and I want to ask you a question that may seem a little bit off, but you'll see why. Am I correct, sir, that you won 3 Purple Hearts over the course of your military career?
Sure.
Okay. Now, the reason I ask that is because there was the predicate question here was, are we pursuing the continuation of the war on drugs, which is, again, the phrase we don't like, out of a lack of courage? Sir, are you following this out of a lack of courage?
It's a statement that you don't trust democracy. It's a statement that parents and pediatricians and school teachers and coaches and ministers have no right to have an alternative view, that the current rates of drug addiction cause immense misery, and we want to prevent, educate, treat, and confront the issue.
Thank you, sir. And again, to conclude, I think it is not a lack of courage that continues the drive to change all of that and eradicate it, just as you had been and as the data suggests you had. Ed, I want to come back to you on this issue of courage. Which do you think would be easier, as a matter of politics, human emotion, to actually do what you proposed about an hour ago, which is to actually go after the money laundering, or to actually just embrace the flavor of the month, which is to say, let's create a regulatory framework which would still leave us with the same black market?
This misconstruing that most people take drugs for recreational reasons, like I have done, and people in this room, no doubt. But this isn't the crisis. The crisis is that life has become so awful in the human slag heaps that global capitalism has caused, that the best thing to do is to obliterate yourself. I'm glad we're talking about politics at last, because the causes of drugs are political in these desperate places. They are poverty and exploitation. And the political courage is to realize that. The war is the liberation of the ghetto, the barrio, and the township against the poverty and exploitation that causes the desperation and the self-obliteration through drugs.
All right. Thank you, Ed. Very, very well said. Now, Peter, I want to go to Peter Hitchens, because Peter was so effective at winning over the audience earlier this evening. So, Peter, but I want you to make and close tonight, and Lord Blair, I'm sorry, we're just running out of time. But Peter, make the moral argument. This is not just a matter of mechanistic policy. There's a moral imperative from your view. What is it?
Well, the main point is that taking drugs is itself wrong, and that is why they are illegal. And one of the reasons we don't address this is because of the extreme selfishness of our society, in which so many people imagine that their own pleasure trumps everything else. Julian Assange said that he was sovereign over his own body. Well, maybe he doesn't have anybody who cares about him. But if your family has to put up with you after you have destroyed your mental health, or in some other way deeply damaged yourself by taking drugs, then you and they will discover that you are not an island and that you have responsibilities to other people. And if there is no other force, apart from the law, which will deter you from taking that semi-suicidal step, then the law needs to be there. That's the main and fundamental point. The other things I hear Sir Richard Branson talking about the taking of drugs, and particularly of that especially dangerous drug, cannabis, sordidly promoted as safe and soft, as a freedom comparable apparently to the freedoms of thought, speech and assembly which make this and others a free country. How can that be? The purpose of drugs is to befuddle us, to cloud our brains, to make us passive. If we are discontented with the society in which we live, surely it is utterly wrong and immoral to turn away from that, to dope ourselves into passivity, to make ourselves perfect fodder for dictators, despots and propagandists, rather than to criticize, change, and reform the society which we find repulsive. And I turn to people on the other side, and I mean to be polite to them when I say the politest thing that I say about them is that they are defeatists, dupes, and profoundly irresponsible. And I very much hope that their message fails and fails and fails again.
Julian Assange, what do you make of Peter Hitchens' statement that taking drugs is wrong and that is why they're illegal, if you're still there?
Well, I was just about to say I couldn't believe that you gave that twat the last word, but apparently it's not so. Look, there's a certain sort of form of Calvinism about the different types of drugs that we see. For example, nicotine, which makes one work harder and work faster and burn out faster, is perfectly legal. So is coffee. It is perfectly legal and makes one work faster and harder. But those drugs which make one relax or make one more imaginative, those drugs are made illegal. And that's Western European Calvinism.
Lord Blair, you said earlier that it was probably an irreversible policy and with the possibility of total catastrophe. Are you saying that all those countries that have taken steps so far cannot reverse those and shouldn't?
I don't think anybody could be against limited experiments, but so far the other side have confused two topics. They've confused decriminalisation and legalisation. They're not the same thing. Julian Assange talks about the civil liberty to take drugs, but there's also a civil liberty for children to grow up in households where adults don't take drugs in front of them. And if we legalise this, that's gone.
The other point about the decriminalisers is they ceaselessly talk about prohibition of alcohol in the United States, a subject about which they often know very little. But it actually is an argument against them. What they're proposing is to make other drugs as legal as alcohol was in the United States before prohibition, and to make them as impossible to put back in the bottle afterwards. You don't know, and you don't care, in my view, you don't know and you don't care what the consequences of what you argue will be.
Okay, it is a fact we do know and do care about that at the end of alcohol prohibition, the murder rate fell by 20%, and it never went back up again until the enforcement of drug prohibition. The two most violent periods in the history of the United States since the Civil War have been when prohibition was being enforced. First alcohol, then drugs. That's a huge number of killings your side and you have to account for.
You've mentioned that big corporations would benefit and profit from legalisation. Are you saying that you'd rather organised crime benefit from it than big corporations?
The war on drugs is an extension of aggressive foreign policy of the superpowers. There's lots of sort of theories and questions. Is it possible that the police and government are continuing the war on drugs because it's big business? That's Solly Solman. You've got from Bernardo on Google, isn't there a clear geopolitical motivation for the militaristic approach to the war on drugs that allows the US to justify having troops in Latin America, Afghanistan? The sentiment sympathetic to producer countries and very hostile to the big consumption centres.
Thanks very much, Jemima. Well, it's now down to the last part of this. Our two advocates are going to summarise the arguments we've heard this evening and give us their final thoughts on that motion. Elliot, you're first up.
Fellas, this is a nuanced policy. We have treatment and health care for users. We must have that coercive pressure, tough love to get people to pursue the treatment. Have you ever had an intervention with an addict? Have you ever seen how difficult it is to get them to do what they desperately don't want to do? If you don't have some coercive pressure, it won't work. This is not because it's an overbearing government that is not friendly to its citizens. These are the tools we have to integrate into one overarching policy. I wish that President Nixon had never used the war on drugs metaphor. It hasn't helped. What we have is a carefully integrated, nuanced policy that evolves over time. Do I agree with you? The recidivism rate coming out of prison is horrifying. Yes, 80+%, because we don't put enough into treatment. Sir Branson, if I could put triple the budget into treatment, I would do it right now. And you know what I do? I tax everybody with income over $1 million to pay for it. That's where I am on these issues. That's the way we're going to solve this problem, not by decriminalizing, not by pretending there's a magic bullet. And let me end in an odd place. Peter Hitchens was right about something. Not everything, but something. We use the criminal code to establish our moral values. We do. That's what they are. That's why it is illegal to have heroin and to sell it and crack and meth. We as a community define our moral code through our criminal statutes. That's what a society is. And that is why, as a society, we have said certain things are fundamentally wrong. Murder, selling crack to kids, producing crack, selling cocaine. Those things are wrong. We make them illegal, and we should. Thank you.
Jeffrey, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Emily. Ladies and gentlemen, the war on drugs is not a failure. It's an absolute bloody disaster. The crime cartels, the gangs making their massive tax-free profits, bribing police, bribing politicians, bribing judges, killing judges and police and politicians. The losers, those 250 million people, the UN tells us, use drugs. Less than 10% have problems, it says. Well, that's 225 million people who don't have problems. Their only problem is the police. Their only problem is the war on drugs, which means prohibition, which means punishment. We know that addicts do not deserve prison. The war on drugs has been a disaster, and yet still we hear it. It's endless, this war. It can't be won, this war. It's interesting, isn't it, that Mr. Costa and everyone after him has avoided the phrase, the war on drugs, because they know they can't defend it. After 40 years of total disaster, no sane person could. So we have Peter Hitchens. We have who wants a surge in the war on drugs. But they say this is a motion, let's legalize all drugs. That's not the motion. Decriminalization, regulation, you can have endless numbers. Ed Valiami says, oh, we've got to have a war on the banks. Fine, we're all in favor of that. A war on money makers, sure. Cocaine, cannabis. Cannabis, for example, you can have sold in coffee shops, as in Amsterdam. You can have sold, like pornography, in shops that are licensed, that exclude 18-year-olds, and you can have a much better way of control. Today, children can get drugs easily. There is a right to freedom of thought. There is a right to change our mood. There is an individual liberty here. Well, let us conclude by saying this. Politicians may be cowardly, or they may just think that we want them to continue the war on drugs, that we're in favor. So this is your opportunity to show them. This is your opportunity to tell truth to power, to vote yes, to tell them, stop wasting money, stop wasting lives. Vote yes to stop the war.
Well, that moment of truth has arrived. Before the debate, and I'm going to take you the web result first, which was 92% for. That was in favour of ending the war on drugs. 3% were against, and 5% didn't know. In the hall, just to remind you, we had 60% in favour of ending the war on drugs. That was for. 15% against. 25% were don't knows. After all the rhetoric and all the arguments, here is what has happened tonight in the hall. We now have 64.8% in favour of ending the war on drugs. We have 29.6% against an end to the war on drugs, and 5.6% don't knows. Just to take you through what that means then, the vote has swung for ending the war on drugs by plus 5% and against plus 15%, to make that a little bit clearer. So the vote for has gone up 5%, the vote against has gone up 15%, and the don't knows have gone down 20%.